All right, let's jump into today's deep dive. We're going to take a look at the political landscape,
Yeah.
post-2024 election. You sent over these CNN clips of Van Jones. And
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you, his analysis of how the Democratic Party did is intense. He really does not hold back. And in fact, he uses this striking metaphor. He says, we woke up in a body bag. What do you think he means by that?
Yeah, it's a powerful image, isn't it? Van Jones, CNN commentator, very well known, key figure during the Obama administration, obviously expressing, sense of shock and devastation within the Democratic Party. And he used that phrase,
Yeah.
on CNN right after the election results came out.
So he drops this body bag metaphor, but what are the implications of that? Like, what died here? And what does that mean for the Democrats going forward?
Well, I think, what Van Jones seems to be arguing is that the Democratic Party lost far more than just an election. They lost touch with a significant part of the electorate. They lost the ability to effectively communicate their message. And perhaps most importantly, they lost the ability to even see this defeat coming.
So it's not just about the immediate loss, but
Yeah,
a deeper sense of failure.
exactly. Yeah, he's suggesting that. The Democratic Party needs a fundamental reassessment of its strategy.
Right.
And its understanding of the current political landscape.
And one of the big things he talks about is that the Democrats were outflanked online. And it's not just that they weren't as active on social media. He seems to be talking about something bigger. What does he see as the problem here?
Yeah, Van Jones points to the rise of, alternative media ecosystems, these spaces where, right-leaning voices have cultivated huge audiences. Think about figures like Joe Rogan, for example, and the massive reach of his podcast. Van Jones is saying that, Democrats have largely ignored these spaces, while Republicans have tapped into them very effectively.
Okay, so it's not just about posting on Facebook. It's about understanding and engaging with these alternative platforms where political conversations are happening. Can you give me a concrete example of how Republicans are using these platforms differently?
Yeah, I think. Van Jones argues that Republicans have understood the power of building direct relationships with their audience through these online channels. They're not just broadcasting messages, they're fostering a sense of community, creating dialogue, and tapping into the emotional energy of these spaces.
And he sees Democrats as falling behind in this area.
Definitely. He's urging them to move beyond traditional media and campaigning methods. He even suggests that. Democrats need to be building their own digital ecosystems, cultivating relationships with influencers who have a strong following online. It's about reaching people where they are, not waiting for them to come to you.
So it's not enough to just have a good message. You need to get that message to the right people in the right way. He even calls Democrats a professional fainting society at one point. What's he getting at there?
Yeah, he's arguing that Democrats have developed this reputation for being, overly sensitive, easily offended, and sort of out of touch with the concerns of, working class voters. Now, whether that perception is accurate or not is certainly debatable. But what Van Jones is saying is that this perception, fair or not, has damaged the party's image and alienated potential voters.
And how does this connect to his concerns about online campaigning?
Well, I think what he seems to be suggesting is that, Democrats' hesitancy to engage in more robust online debate where things can get heated and controversial has contributed to this perception. By avoiding these spaces, they're missing an opportunity to connect with people who might disagree with them, to understand their concerns, and to present their own arguments in a more relatable way.
So you're listening to this and you're thinking, wait, is he saying Democrats need to get down in the mud and fight dirty online?
Not necessarily. I think what he's saying is they need to be less afraid of engaging in challenging conversations and more willing to connect with people who hold different views. The online world can be a messy and unpredictable place, but it's also where a lot of people are forming their political opinions.
So Democrats need to be more comfortable with this sort of wild west of online discourse.
It's not about embracing every aspect of online culture, but it is about recognizing that these online platforms are important battlegrounds in the fight for hearts and minds.
So there's this idea of Democrats clinging to the old rules of the game, while Republicans have adapted to a new reality.
Right, and that's where I think Van Jones's warning becomes really relevant for you, the listener. This shift in political communication isn't limited to one party or one election. It's a fundamental change in how we engage with politics.
It seems like he's delivering a wake-up call, not just to Democrats, but to anyone who cares about the future of political discourse.
Absolutely. He's challenging all of us to think more critically about how we participate in the political process in a world where information flows so rapidly and online platforms have such a powerful influence.
Okay, so we've got this sense of urgency, this feeling that Democrats are missing the boat when it comes to online engagement. But Van Jones also acknowledges some of Biden's accomplishments. Doesn't that complicate the picture a bit?
It does. What's interesting is that Van Jones doesn't shy away from praising the Biden administration, particularly on issues like infrastructure, passing the CHES Act, and addressing some key concerns for working-class voters. He even suggests that, history might judge Biden more favorably than the current political climate suggests.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's this tension here between acknowledging those achievements and sounding the alarm about what Democrats are doing wrong.
Exactly. And I think that tension is what makes Van Jones's commentary so fascinating. He's not just pointing fingers, he's grappling with these complex questions about the future of the Democratic Party.
And where does Scott Jennings fit into all of this? You sent over a clip of his response to Van Jones.
Yeah.
And he had a very different take on things.
Right. Scott Jennings, who's a Republican strategist, pushes back on Van Jones's analysis. He argues that the Democratic Party's problems run deeper than just online strategy. He points to President Biden's low approval ratings and the perception of cognitive decline as major factors in their defeat.
So Jennings is saying that it's not just about messaging, it's about the messenger himself.
Exactly. And he goes even further, accusing the Democratic Party of essentially lying to the American people about Biden's capability.
Wow, that's a pretty strong accusation. It seems like he's laying the blame squarely at the feet of Biden and the Democratic establishment, rather than focusing on online strategy like Van Jones.
Yes, and that highlights, I think, a fundamental difference in how they're framing the problem. Jennings sees it as a problem of leadership and honesty, while Van Jones sees it as a problem of adaptation and strategy.
It sounds like we've got two very different diagnoses here, which raises the question, are they even talking about the same illness? We'll have to dive deeper into that in just a moment. But first, a quick word from our sponsors.
It's fascinating how these two perspectives, while seemingly contradictory, might actually be interconnected. Could it be that? The Democrats' failure to adapt to this new media landscape actually contributed to the very perceptions that Jennings is highlighting.
So you're saying that by not engaging effectively online, Democrats might have inadvertently reinforced this narrative of Biden being out of touch or ineffective?
Exactly. If they're not present in those spaces. Where these narratives are taking shape, they're ceding ground to their opponents. They're letting those negative perceptions go unchallenged.
And that brings us back to Van Jones's point about Democrats needing to be less of a professional thinking society. Could he be saying that? Their perceived sensitivity has actually made them more vulnerable to these kinds of attacks.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Could it be that by being overly cautious and hesitant to engage in really robust debate, they've inadvertently created a vacuum that their opponents have been happy to fill?
So it's not just about what they're saying, it's about where they're saying it, or rather where they're not saying it.
Precisely. And that's where I think the comparison to figures like Joe Rogan becomes really illuminating. He's built this platform where he can speak directly to millions of people, unfiltered, unmediated. He's not afraid to tackle controversial topics, and he's cultivated an audience that values his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom.
And what can Democrats learn from that? Are you saying they need to start their own Joe Rogan-style podcasts?
I don't think it's necessarily about replicating what Rogan is doing, but it is about understanding the principles behind his success. He's created a space where people feel heard, where they can engage in open and honest dialogue, even if they disagree. And that's something I think Democrats could learn from.
But wouldn't that require a pretty significant shift in mindset? It seems like Democrats have traditionally been more comfortable operating within the established media ecosystem, relying on newspapers, cable news, official channels to get their message out.
Absolutely. It would require them to embrace a more decentralized and less hierarchical approach to communication. They need to be willing to empower individuals and groups within the party to speak directly to voters, to build relationships, and to engage in these authentic conversations.
So less top-down control, more grassroots energy.
Exactly. It's about trusting your base, empowering them to be ambassadors for your message, and creating a more participatory and dynamic form of political engagement.
Okay, so we've got this idea of Democrats needing to build their own digital ecosystems to engage more effectively online, to be less afraid of robust debate. But how does this translate into concrete action? Like, what are some of the specific steps they could be taking?
Well, I think one obvious step would be to invest more heavily in digital infrastructure and talent. You know they need to build a strong team of people who understand the nuances of online communication, who can create compelling content, and who can cultivate relationships with key influencers.
So it's not just about hiring a bunch of social media interns
Yeah,
and hoping for the best.
right. It requires a more strategic and sophisticated approach. You know, it's about identifying the platforms where their target audience is spending time, understanding the dynamics of those platforms, and developing a content strategy that is tailored to those specific audiences.
And it's about being more comfortable with experimentation,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Trying new things, seeing what works, and adapting quickly.
Exactly. You know, the online world is constantly evolving. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. So Democrats need to be more agile and adaptive in their approach.
It's like they need to embrace a fail fast, learn faster mentality.
That's a good way to put it. You know, they need to be willing to take risks, to learn from their mistakes, and to constantly iterate and improve their online strategy.
And all of this comes back to that body bag metaphor, right?
Right.
It's not just that they lost an election. They lost because they failed to adapt to a changing environment. They were clinging to outdated strategies
Yeah.
while the world was moving on without them.
Exactly. And that's the danger for any organization, political or otherwise, that fails to keep pace with change.
And that raises a really crucial question. Can the Democratic Party make these changes? Can they adapt to this new reality? Or are they too entrenched in their old ways of doing things?
It's a question worth pondering. You know they certainly face significant challenges. They have a lot of ground to make up, and they need to overcome a certain amount of institutional inertia. But if they can learn from their mistakes and embrace a more forward-looking approach, you know they have a chance to regain their footing and connect with voters in a more meaningful way.
Okay, before we move on to Van Jones' take on Nancy Pelosi's comments, let's take a quick pause. Okay, we are back and ready to sort of finish unpacking this Van Jones analysis. And you also sent over a clip of him discussing Nancy Pelosi's comments about Biden's decision to run again. What was her take, and how does Van Jones kind of interpret that?
Yeah, so Nancy Pelosi gave this interview with the New York Times, and she basically suggested that, Biden running for re-election might have hurt the Democrats' chances, which was a pretty controversial statement coming from someone like Pelosi.
So she seemed to be implying that maybe a different candidate would have performed better.
That's how a lot of people interpreted her remarks, yes.
Okay.
But Van Jones offers a slightly different perspective. I think, he sees Pelosi's comments as reflecting the incredibly difficult situation Democrats found themselves in rather than like a direct attack on Biden's leadership.
Okay, so he's saying she wasn't necessarily throwing Biden under the bus, but just acknowledging the tough political reality they were facing.
Right. Remember at the time of his decision to run, Biden was actually enjoying a wave of success with key legislative wins. So, it's easy to look back now and say it was a mistake, but at the time it might have seemed like the logical choice.
So Van Jones is walking a fine line here. He's highly critical of the Democratic Party's strategy, especially when it comes to online engagement. But he's also defending Biden's record and trying to offer a path forward.
Exactly. I think he's highlighting the complexity of the situation, acknowledging both the missteps and the achievements.
It's clear he's very passionate about this topic and genuinely concerned about the future of the Democratic Party.
Absolutely. And that's what makes his commentary so compelling. He's not just some pundit offering talking points. He's someone who's deeply invested in these issues, and he's grappling with them in a very public and very honest way.
Well, he's certainly given us a lot to think about. If you had to distill his analysis down to like one key takeaway, what would it be? What's the most important insight for you, the listener, to walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that, the rules of political engagement have changed, and the Democratic Party needs to adapt or risk becoming increasingly irrelevant. They can't afford to ignore the power of online platforms, the importance of building relationships with influencers, and the need to engage in more direct and authentic dialogue with voters.
It's about meeting people where they're speaking their language and understanding the emotional dynamics of these new media spaces.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the battle for hearts and minds is increasingly being fought online, and the Democrats need to bring their A game if they want to win.
It's like Van Jones is saying, hey, Democrats, The alarm clock is ringing. It's time to wake up and smell the digital coffee.
Yeah, and for you, the listener, the challenge is to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking these critical questions about how politics is evolving in the digital age, because whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, these changes are going to affect all of us.
It's so true. We're all in this together, navigating this brave new world of political communication. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. And if you want to keep exploring these ideas with us, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the most important topics of the day.